The Puppet Master. In the summer of 1993, a young man named John Atkinson walked into a police station and told officers something that, on its face, sounded like the plot of a spy thriller. He said he had spent the past several weeks secretly training to be an undercover informant for MI5, tasked with monitoring suspected IRA sympathizers at his own agricultural college. He believed his cover had been blown. He believed his life and the lives of his friends were in immediate danger. Nothing, he said, was true. There was no MI5 operation. There was no informant network. There was only a bartender from a local pub, and a lie so carefully constructed that it would go on to consume 10 years of several people's lives. This is the story of Robert Hendy-Freegard, the man British newspapers would eventually call the Puppet Master. Freegard's deception began in 1993, while he was working as a barman at the Swan, a pub in Newport, Shropshire. He was, by most accounts, an unremarkable-looking man in his early 20s, unassuming enough that no one who met him would have guessed at the scale of manipulation he was capable of. At the Swan, Freegard befriended a local student named John Atkinson, who attended nearby Harper Adams Agricultural College. Freegard convinced Atkinson that he was, in fact, an undercover MI5 agent, and that he needed Atkinson's help acting as an informant, watching for possible IRA connections among the students at his school. To a young man in his late teens, the idea of being secretly recruited into national intelligence work was intoxicating. Freegard understood this. He tested Atkinson's loyalty repeatedly through a series of manufactured trials and training exercises designed to make the fiction feel real, deepening Atkinson's belief with every test he passed. Then came the turn that would define the entire scheme. Freegard told Atkinson that their cover had been blown, that the IRA now knew who they were, and that the only way to survive was to go on the run immediately. Atkinson, terrified and fully convinced, agreed. Between them, the two men persuaded two more students to join them, Sarah Smith and Maria Handy. Both told a cover story that Atkinson was dying of cancer, and the group was simply taking a final trip around Britain together before he passed. What followed was not a brief con.
Resolved within days or weeks, it stretched on for years. Believing they were being instructed by MI5, Atkinson told his friends a series of increasingly elaborate lies to keep them moving, keep them isolated, and keep them convinced that danger was always just behind them. The group crisscrossed the country under new identities, living in poor conditions, cut off from their families, dependent entirely on the fictional world Freegard had built around them. Freegard's method relied on total psychological control. He pressured his victims to cut off contact with friends and family entirely, subjected them to ongoing loyalty tests, and isolated them in poor living conditions, all while framing every hardship as a necessary sacrifice for their own survival. He instructed victims not to go to the police under any circumstances, warning them that officers might themselves be compromised, double agents working against the very operation he claimed to be running. Some victims genuinely believed, for years, that contacting the authorities could get them killed. The financial cost to his victims was severe. Sarah Smith, one of the original students drawn into the scheme, would later describe being brainwashed and starved over the course of a 10-year ordeal, during which she was conned out of an inheritance worth £180,000. Meanwhile, the money extracted from his victims was not being funneled into any intelligence operation. Freegard used the funds to finance a lavish personal lifestyle, including a string of top-of-the-range cars. What makes the case especially disturbing to those who study it is not simply the length of the deception, but the emotional bond Freegard managed to cultivate within it. Beyond his male recruits, Freegard seduced at least 5 women over the course of his scheme, in several cases proposing marriage to secure even deeper loyalty and financial control. One legal analysis of the case would later suggest that some of his longest-held victims may have been suffering from a form of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological attachment to a captor built not through physical imprisonment, but through prolonged isolation, dependency,
and manufactured fear. Not every relationship Freegard built ended in quiet compliance. One woman, Allison, eventually tried to end things with him after realizing she had been financially and emotionally drained by the relationship. Freegard's reaction was violent enough that Allison fled 200 miles away to Newport, Shropshire, hoping to put real distance between them. When Freegard tracked her down and broke into her new home, Allison's friends, alarmed by his behavior, reported him to the police, and he appeared in court on kidnapping charges in January 1993. It would prove to be only the first, smallest thread in a case that would eventually stretch across an entire decade. For years, Freegard continued operating with near-total freedom, moving between victims, identities, and fabricated crises. In total, the pattern of deception and theft that investigators eventually documented spanned a full decade, from 1993 to 2003, and touched at least 5 confirmed victims: John Atkinson, Sarah Smith, Caroline Cowper, Elizabeth Richardson, and Kimberly Adams. As investigators began piecing together the true scope of Freegard's activity, the picture that emerged was chilling in its geographic reach. Police eventually located a hotel room in the French Alps containing the passports of several missing women, evidence that helped investigators begin actively searching for victims who had in effect vanished from their old lives entirely. In the summer of 2003, one of those victims, Sarah Smith, was finally located, working as a housekeeper for a woman named Renata Kister, having been instructed by Freegard to pretend she could not speak English, a final layer of control designed to keep her isolated even from casual conversation. Another victim, Elizabeth Richardson, was not found until the fall of 2003, discovered living in a hotel in Dunton Bassett, her body covered in sores from the condition she had endured. Once investigators had located and interviewed his victims, the case moved to trial. Freegard's trial at the Crown Court at Blackfriars lasted approximately 8 months, one of the longest and most complex fraud trials British courts had seen in years. During the proceedings, his defense faced its own turmoil. He had originally retained 4 separate lawyers, 3 of whom withdrew from the case, citing professional embarrassment over the details being presented in court. On June 23, 2005, Freegard was convicted of 2 counts of kidnapping, the first relating to John Atkinson, the second to Sarah Smith, along with 10 counts of theft, 5 counts of obtaining a money transfer by deception, and 3 counts of procuring the execution of a valuable security by deception. On September 6, 2005, the trial judge sentenced Freegard to life imprisonment on both kidnapping counts, with a recommended minimum term of 7.5 years on the first and 10 years on the second. At the time, it was one of the most severe sentences ever handed down in the UK for a fraud case that had involved no physical violence in the traditional sense, a reflection of just how seriously the court weighed the psychological captivity Freegard had inflicted on his victims. The case did not end there. Freegard's legal team appealed the kidnapping conviction specifically, arguing that his victims had never been physically restrained or imprisoned in the traditional sense. They had, technically, always been free to walk away. In 2007, the Court of Appeal agreed, ruling that the kidnapping convictions were unsafe precisely because his victims had not been physically deprived of their freedom, only psychologically controlled. The life sentences were overturned, and Freegard's sentence was reduced dramatically, ultimately leaving him likely to be released well before the decade his original sentence had implied. For his victims, the appeal's outcome was devastating in a different way than the original crime had been. Sarah Smith told reporters she was stunned and devastated by the decision, saying that her faith in the courts had been completely shaken. Both Smith and Atkinson had, by the court's own account, spent years of their lives under Freegard's near-total psychological control. Smith enduring it for a full decade, Atkinson for roughly 3 years. Yet the legal system's definition of kidnapping had no clear framework for captivity that left no physical chains behind. Freegard was eventually released from prison, his case becoming a landmark example, studied by legal scholars, of how difficult it can be to prosecute coercive psychological control under laws written primarily to address physical confinement. In the years following his release, Further allegations of manipulation and deception continued to surface around him, and in 2025, decades after his original conviction, Freegard was convicted again, this time for violence against public officials, and sentenced to 6 additional years in prison. The case of Robert Hendy-Freegard remains one of the most studied examples in British criminal history of pure psychological coercion, a decade-long deception that required no weapons, no physical restraints, and no accomplices beyond the victim's own manufactured fear. What makes it endure beyond the sheer length of the con is the uncomfortable question it leaves behind. How much captivity can a person endure without ever being technically imprisoned at all? And what does the law owe to victims whose chains were never visible, only real?